All right, welcome to the Network Plumbing Working Group meeting on April 12th, 2018. I'm Doug Smith, standing in for Dan Williams. It looks like we have a fairly light agenda today. So we should be able to rip through this pretty quickly, but let's kick it off. Just a quick update on my end that Karal, Tomo, and I are continuing to collaborate on a reference implementation, and we're hoping to demo that to you guys in one of the next upcoming few meetings, maybe the next, maybe the one after that, but hopefully soon. And as we've kind of, it looks like we're getting the specification here to a bit more of a more stable state. On that note, I'll move on to the first item here in the list, which I added, which is a couple meetings ago. Since then, I had updated the specification for multiple attachments and for the default network functionality, and I was wondering if anyone had any input on those items. They tend to gloss over especially the portion where we had mentioned a workaround where having an interface name at network attachment configuration name standard, and you know that there's a possibility to make some changes upstream in CNI. It glossed over that, but it kind of allows to say that, you know, the meta plugin may create unique interface names in the case where you would use an interface, you know, allowing also for the fact that there may be user space networking plugins that don't use a network name at all. Anyone have any feedback on those sections?
So
all right.
Could you repeat the second? Sorry, could you repeat the second point again?
Yeah. So that was that. Hey, Mike. It really basically allows for a kind of may clause, saying that the meta plugin may allow the creation of unique interface names as it creates basically duplicates of the attachments. So, you know, if you say net A, comma, net A, as a user, you may expect it to create, say, a net 1 and net 2 interface name. However, I tried to word it in such a way that both covers the fact that that may not work for some plugins, and that there may be plugins that don't care about the interface name at all.
CNI doesn't really give the plugin a choice to not care, right?
Yeah, so that's right. So, for example, I know Karal had had a case where maybe it's with, I'm forgetting which plugin, but he just had to create the name anyways and then ignore it essentially. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that if you use the delegate add method from Scal, that it says, hey, give me a interface name, right?
Yeah. So is the use case? I think one of the user called Suresh from Column mentioned that there should be a unique name if it's generating a unique ID with names, but I'm not sure if there is any more use cases is there for this particular feature that the meta plugin has to do.
Yeah, I kind of think that what Suresh suggested is a good and pragmatic workaround for the shorter term, and that we may want to add that to the specification, and maybe with the plan that later on we would try to form maybe a team of people from this group that might go upstream to CNI and try to make a proposal there. I know Dan had mentioned that the maintainers were at least warm to the idea, if not necessarily hot on doing that work themselves.
I think that's the best thing to do, and I threatened to do it a few weeks ago. I'm sorry I haven't gotten around to it. Can whoever's making that noise mute, please? Okay. So yeah, I think going upstream is the way to fix this, really. I threatened to do something about that a few weeks ago and never got around to it. I'm regretting that and getting remotivated. So let me try and take a crack at that, and I'll be happy to share with. We still don't have a mailing list, right? I'll just send something to the networking group mailing list.
Yeah, send something to the network mailing list, and Mike, I'm interested in that too. And if you want, you can ping me on Kubernetes Slack. I'm Doug BTV. Okay. I'd be happy to take a look or contribute if I can. So
yeah, I mean, if you want to take a first crack, that's okay by me. If you don't, then I'll do something.
I may not be able to get to it primarily for a couple weeks, maybe, but I would like to stay in touch with it. Okay. With whoever takes it on, and I'd like to provide any support that I could too.
Okay. Yeah, I got another emergency burning this week, a couple emergencies this week. I won't get till the next week, but I'll try to do that.
All right, that's awesome. Thank you, Mike. That's wicked good. All right, excellent. Does anyone else have any other notes on this particular topic? Okay, all right.
If I may, I'd like to do one minor digression.
Sure, yeah, please.
There's people are, when they want to refer to the implementation of this, they say the meta plugin. But I have a problem with that, right? For the reasons we've discussed, a plugin is invoked only at pod setup time, and I want to be able to track changes dynamically here. So, you may prototype an initial implementation with a plugin, but I think I'd rather hear words, like the implementation with a presumption that it must be a plugin. I think we want to move for various reasons to more of a daemon model.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, so you actually do have after startup time, need to be able to dynamically do things as you go on? Is that what you're saying, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I'm motivated by, I'm coming from the angle of people who are trying to implement virtual machines in pods. And so virtual machines, it's kind of common to be able to dynamically change their network attachments. So it's, consequently, it would be desirable to be able to do that with a pod.
Yeah, I'm with you there, and I think that this is definitely important. And my current focus in the context of the agenda is to ensure that the specification allows for this idea of the thick plugin. So this is something we've kind of discussed before: is thin plugin, thick plugin. And I believe that there is, I'm looking for it in the spec, but I believe that there's some language in here that at least hints at this idea.
Yeah, it's discussed in the issues at the end. Okay. But the very first sentence in this thing talks about the meta plugin. So that's kind of a presumption that is the only way to implement it, and I have an objection to that.
I think there is 3 modes are there. If you look into documentation examples, you can see thin plugin examples and then thick plugin examples and the config files examples. I think the second one is some kind of the thick plugin case, which we are talking about here.
So my concern is not thick plugin versus thin plugin. My problem is that the idea that the existing interface between kubelet, CRI, and CNI, a plugin, it only invokes the whatever plugin, whether it's thick or thin, it only invokes it at startup time. And that rules out being able to dynamically track changes. So that's my objection. I want to see, the discussion in terms of the implementation, noting that we may start with a limited implementation that doesn't track changes dynamically, but we aim for an implementation. We allow for an implementation that does track changes dynamically.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So, I mean, there are other ways of thinking about this problem that sort of intrinsically start from a dynamic viewpoint. Part of the problem is that CNI and kubelet and what they're doing very definitionally sets up networking at startup time, and that's it. There were some ideas that were bouncing around at ONS a couple of weeks ago that would look at the problem from a slightly different angle and allow you, and just naturally as a side effect of the different viewpoint on the problem, involve dynamic attachments.
Can you elaborate on that?
I mean, I can if folks want to. I don't want to hijack the meeting on it. But I could certainly talk folks through the idea if they're interested. I do have the slides from the ONS that we're talking about. I know Curl's familiar with the idea, but I don't want to go hijacking folks' meetings. So,
well, if you can do it in less than 5 minutes, I'd be interested in seeing it.
It probably clocks in closer to 20.
Ooh.
Just because there's context involved, right? Because part of it involves thinking about the problem differently than the way that we thought about it in sort of the traditional VM world, and thinking about it more in terms of the way that the cloud native world thinks about these things, but still allows us to get the thing that we actually need at the end of the day. Does that make sense?
As much as such big words can. So you could. I'd like to see you send it to the mailing list, or maybe we can decide here we have time on the agenda. I don't know.
Whatever folks want to do is fine.
How about this? Let's put it at the end of the agenda here to let people who needed to get a few items on here in advance, give them the chance, and we can make a judgment call based on the time. Does that sound good?
Sure. Sounds good.
All right, great. Anyways, something that I wanted to bring up briefly, at least, was a thought that I had regarding a item in the spec that reads, should a cluster or namespace administrator or someone else be able to prevent certain pods from attaching to certain networks? And it was brought up at one point that maybe CRDs may be able to do this. However, the thought that I had was that since this is a free-form field that allows the user who's creating a pod to enter into it, and then it is read by for the sake of not saying a meta plugin, for saying a resident daemon or thin implementation, it will refer to its credentials when it reads that, right? So I wanted to bring that up as food for thought, or to hear anyone's particular use cases that might make this more of a primary consideration that may need more wording in the specification.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a legitimate question. I think I can think of some ways to maybe abuse some of the concepts we have. I'm not sure if we should start with the abuse or nothing at all. But for example, we could say, I think, that the implementation, whatever style it be in, can check whether the service account that the pod is running under is authorized to read this attachment definition and allow access or not based on that. It's a bit of an abuse, but it's a way to get some control using existing mechanisms.
I'm making a note of this because I feel like that's a fairly good start at how to address this issue. I think that's probably at least if I was thinking about it, like here's just a use case to throw out there. You have whatever senior admin and junior admin's only allowed to attach to this subset of networks, right? You'd probably look at what's the service account for this. So yeah, I like that under my made up use case. Great. I'll get that in my notes and maybe take a look at the spec to see if there's a good way to point that out, and maybe at some point here put it in a reference implementation. Any other notes on that? Food for thought. Otherwise, I can move on to Petter's issue here. All right, Petter, take it away, man.
So I don't have answers. I mean, the question is, how do we handle? I mean, for heterogeneous networks, we might have a resource per network, but how do we want to handle logical networks? Let's say we have an overlay with 1,000 networks, and we don't want to create one resource per each logical network there. So I wondered if anyone has any ideas on that and how we should handle it.
Yeah, I think you're presuming, making a mistaken assumption, which is that each network needs to be a separate resource. I think if you've got 1,000 networks, probably 900 and some odd of them are all consuming SRIOV channels. So you've really only got one resource of concern here, which is the SRIOV channels.
Yeah, so that wasn't the problem I was looking at. I mean, when we have whatever overlay, let's say we have OVN, and we can expose the OVN, all OVN networks as one resource, and then select the specific network as an attribute.
Well, if you're using OVN to make overlay networks, these are what Tim classified as infinite networks. There's not even any resource that you need to track at all. They're just available everywhere. You don't have a scheduler problem. There's no need to make it a resource.
Okay, but I was thinking about this. We will handle it with device plugins and resource. So all networks are implemented the same way with device plugins.
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to say that networks themselves need to be resources. I think the device plugin, and most particularly the scheduler, needs to be used for computational resources that get consumed, and must not be used for virtual resources that can be multiplied arbitrarily.
All right, and how do we handle infinite networks? I mean, we need a different mechanism than device plugins, right?
The device plugin itself, that's right, doesn't necessarily need to implement the network. Yeah, we can't burden the scheduler with 1,000 virtual networks when they're coming for free.
Yeah, so the idea to select the specific network with some attribute, it was bring up the last meeting, I think. So that could solve it, right? So there will be only one resource for all those networks, and we don't need the schedule involved because all of them are available on each node, right? So
well, in the LVN case, there's 0 resources. If it's an SRIOV thing, they might all be sharing one resource.
I don't necessarily agree, because I think that it is only not a resource if it's really available to all nodes. If we speak about a homogeneous cluster, whenever we break that assumption, then it does become important during scheduling if a node has access to that OVN or not.
Right. So it's typically characteristic of OVN that it's a virtual overlay that all the nodes can participate in. Right? I mean, OVN makes virtual overlays, many of them, and all nodes have access to them.
Yeah. So I think still, if we try to fit that into the pattern, if we say, we want to expose OVN as a resource, then I still the question is, how could we say to what network of that resource do we want to get attached? And then I agree with Peter. Then having something like an attribute to that resource makes sense. And then also we don't put the burden on the scheduler, because we effectively just have one resource, which is the availability or connectivity to OVN.
I think we've seen two proposals for how to get device plugin involved here, and I think they're different. I'm trying to remember. I thought we had one of them that did not require every network to be a resource. I just they're not. It just seems spurious.
Yeah, I think today it's not possible today the problem really is that for every network we want to represent, we would have to expose a separate resource, because the value or the request you can do to a device plugin is just, an integer. You can just request the number of, the count of that resource you want to assign to a pod. So, and how the difference between the two proposals is actually just that the one proposal has an admission controller, which is taking, the de facto standard annotation, using the annotation and mapping that to the resources and putting once for every network you want to consume. And the other proposal is just doing that manually, so writing down the resources. But effectively, it's a limitation of the device plugin API. So to me, actually, the question is if the device plugin API either takes parameters or will permit other values than integers as values for resources. I think the second thing, different values than integers for resources, doesn't sound good.
Sorry,
one of
go
the
on.
so one of the basic difference I see in the proposal, gaps I could say, is like you considering the network resources, which is like bounding to the pods containers. So if you take a network, it's bounded to the pod, it's not a container at the end of the day. So both the proposal consider the network as a kind of resources for the containers. If you device plugin is basically does the resource allocation for the containers, it's not doing for the pod. If you have two network containers currently, then none of the device plugin proposals is addressing that issue. So for which container is going to invoke that network currently? I think that's a major gap I see in both the proposal. They are considering the network resources or logical network or overlay network as a container thing and not as a pod thing or shared resources between the containers.
Yeah, that's a gap. That's true. That's also an API issue. Then the question is, yes. So
yeah, it's bring back to me the same thing which Mike has posted like this week about the unification of. I just added it in the last agenda. Like, what is the idea on unification of device and network plugins? Whether we want to go for some kind of network manager, so that will take care of doing the networking, or we are rat holing on some other wrong model of doing the networking in device plugin cases. That's a huge gap I'm thinking, because if you consider network as a resource, right? For example, if you take SRIB, right? In case of DPDK or user space things, the SRIB network is considered as a resource per container. It's not per pod. So I think that's where this confusion comes in, whether the network is a pod resource or the container resource, or which model we are going to take that one, whether we ought to go for some other new model kind of network manager which act like a plugin model, so that all the device manager and the CNI could be able to connect to the network manager, and network manager will take care of all this stuff.
Well, now that you mention it, it does seem a little bit odd. I think it's actually a proper issue to bring to the whole device plugin framework, right? The question of whether something is specific to a container or the pod, I doubt that that's unique to networks. right? There might be devices that are like storage volumes.
I think it was bring up on the face-to-face, like the resource management group, and I mean they will eventually work on the pod wide resources or to have the device per the whole pod, but it's a low priority. And I mean,
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you. It's what?
It's low priority. But,
low priority.
But for the, I mean, in the whole solution for the multiple networks, what we can do is that when a pod has the annotation that requests a network, what we do in an admission control could be that we create a sidecar that will request this resource. So the resource won't be requested by any container. It will be just an annotation of the pod. And some admission controller would create the side container that will ask for the resource, and it will be bring into the pod network namespace. And I was thinking about, like, for the logical networks, the scheduler might be beneficial as well, because if we have one resource for the whole OVN, then let's say temporarily, because there are not unlimited resources, we have 1,000 possible connections to this overlay. And so if there are 100 pod requesting this access to a network that is in this overlay, it can be scheduled on multiple nodes, so it's like balanced across them, right? Because there is the throughput or the bandwidth on each node for the overlay is limited. So if we have one resource, it would be balanced across nodes. Maybe.
Well, I mean, bandwidth is something you can talk about quite independently of this. Even if you're making all the attachments to one network, you can still talk about allocating bandwidth. That's another story.
Sorry, could you repeat it? I don't quite get it.
Sure. I mean, I think you were raising the issue of allocating bandwidth, and that's a legitimate question, but it's, I think, an independent question. Even if there's only one network in the whole world, you can still talk about managing the bandwidth on that network.
Yeah, right. I'm just saying that, I mean, so the OVN would use just one interface for the overlay. So all those networks will share this one interface, and by
Right.
using one resource for all those networks, it would balance. And no matter what network it is, it would still balance the whole overlay, not individual networks.
And I'm just saying that that same effect obtains in Kubernetes today, even without any virtualization or overlays. Typically, there is one network interface that is used for I/O for all the pods. And so there is still a question of potentially managing the bandwidth on that one network interface. Even without anything we're discussing, it's a separate question.
All right.
By the way, getting back to your initial question, Peter, I think one option is actually to represent the OVN connectivity as a single resource and then providing the details for the OVN as a pod annotation. But this actually depends on the open question if we can provide the pod details to the device plugin.
That's what I was thinking about, but maybe there would be a problem that some networks, the heterogeneous one, we handle in one way, but for infinite networks and for overlays, we handle it in different way, and then could maybe cause some problems, but I cannot think of any, but maybe.
Honestly, I hope that this issue will be addressed by looking at the device plugin API. Like we have seen requests from other use cases about providing some kind of generic key value pairs attached to resources or resource requests. And I think that this point about, infinite resources or an infinite number of networks for a given resource, I don't want to say could be resolved, but there's at least the opportunity to see that we could use such a generic mechanism to
Or maybe, I mean, many people ask for so the pod ID is passed to allocate call, and that would give us a tool to obtain any attributes that are on the pod, asking for, or in the network object that if the attribute that specifies the logical network is in the network object, we can look it up if we get the pod ID, so the device plugin.
I'm sorry, I think you're maybe assuming a singular where we've got a multiple.
What do you mean?
Well, I think you said something about the annotation that specifies the network. We're talking about an annotation that specifies multiple networks.
I was just saying that if let's say we have the network object and it asks for the resource OVN and it specifies the network name red. So if we get the allocate call with pod ID, we can look up the network that pod asks for, and then in the network we will obtain both the resource and the specific network that it asks for. So it's just some hack that would allow us to have this key value pairs. But it's an implementation detail.
You used a singular here where we got a multiple. You talked again about the network that a pod is asking for, but we're talking here about a pod asking for multiple networks. And
as far as
go on.
No, I just want to say, I think as far as I understand what Peter is saying, that should also work for multiple networks, because effectively we would have an annotation which is either listing a single network or multiple networks. I mean, that's the de facto standard which is being discussed. And if the device plugin has the ability to read the pod details, however, through what mechanism, then we can either read a single network or multiple networks. I'm not seeing a difference there.
Right. No, the interesting part we haven't discussed yet, which is let's talk about the case of multiple networks. And let's talk about multiple networks that use the same kind of resource. Now,
yeah, that's right. I see your point now. Yeah.
So just to spell it out for everybody, the issue is now we're calling the device manager to allocate, to choose individual devices for, it's going to be called multiple times for the same pod to choose individual devices, right? Someone needs to, the most natural approach would be someone has to remember which device they got in an allocate call made was for which network attachment.
Exactly.
Right, when there's multiple for the same pod. So just knowing the pod ID isn't enough.
Because there could be different resources be used, network resources.
Well, there could be multiple network attachments that use the same resource. We've talked about SRIOV channels or OVN, right? If you've got two attachments that both consume the same kind of resource, you're going to make two allocate calls or the same device plugin for the same pod.
Yeah, and today that's true. And that the question that can be changed, because we could also say that, if there was something like, parameters or attributes to resources, then it would be a single call where the attribute then would contain the list of networks to connect to. So we would say, take that SRIOV resource and pass as a parameter the networks to use. And then it would be a single allocate call.
Yeah, but we're really torquing things around here. I mean, now we're we got two levels of multiplicity now.
So, I mean, one thing I might suggest is I think what we're seeing is the limitation of this particular way of looking at the problem, right? Really quite strongly. We've hit it several times in the course of the discussions today. And I think, maybe looking at the problem differently might help.
Sorry, could you repeat the last part?
Maybe looking at the problem differently might help.
Do you have a suggestion how to look at it?
I do if you guys have time for it, as I said. This is something that came up and got developed at ONS, where a bunch of people were looking at this in the context of NFV, which has many of the challenges we're trying to solve here. And I've been kind of biting my tongue a little bit because it's things like, some of what Peter was saying with, oh, wait, I want to have a single sort of what you guys are calling an attachment, but I want to be able to dynamically say what that means to oven and that kind of stuff. Kind of flow naturally into the network service mesh model that came up at ONS. So if you guys would like to get the quick run through, I'm happy to do that. But again, I don't want to hijack your meeting.
Hey Ed, I probably speak for all of us when we will appreciate a run through of this, but given that it's about 20 minutes and there are still
Perfect. You can do it later. No problem.
Yeah, I do suggest that you get it on the agenda for the next time around at the meeting.
Send it to the mailing list and put it on the agenda for next meeting. Maybe we should put it on the, Ed, do you think it makes sense for the next week for the network sig meeting?
I mean, it could. I'm trying to figure out what the pieces are on the network sig meeting, though, because I don't want to bum rush the network sig meeting. I don't know what the etiquette is for adding people to that particular meeting.
I think Ed,
probably know better than I do.
Yeah, I think the network plumbing group could be the right choice for you. I've seen through your presentation. I like the idea. I think by next plumbing working group, I think most of them could be familiar with your idea. I think. I don't think the network sig group could be the correct group for this particular idea. That's my opinion. So you can we should present this one in this group actually.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a fair assessment, and again, it's one of those things where I just didn't want to show up with something that was going to be off topic there.
By the way, it sounds like you have a slide deck or some introductory material. Could you share that somewhere ahead of time?
Yeah, absolutely. Hang on, I can actually share that right here on the chat if you'd like.
No, it'll be lost when the meeting's over. Send it to
the It's better if you post it in as a mailing list, actually.
Yeah. So, okay. So we're on the network sig mailing list. Then is what you're telling me?
Yeah.
Cool. I put it in the chat. I'll also send it out there.
I added it to the notes.
Yeah,
that's a brilliant thing, actually.
Nice. Yeah. Thank you for doing that. That's excellent. All right, that being said, that we still have a few more items on the agenda. Do you guys mind if I move on here from Petter's topic? A lot of good conversation there. I just want to make sure that everybody's got their voice this meeting. All right, great. That being the case, Coral, would you like to speak to the chaining mechanism?
Yeah, I think we captured a lot of the mechanism, but I don't know whether we missed out or omitted the chaining mechanism in the meta plugin. What will happen if you want to do some chaining mechanisms? So currently we have some few chaining mechanism CNA plugins. So I think we missed out that one. If you put the chaining mechanism plugin as a configuration in the network CRDs. So currently it will support the config list, but it won't support the network CRDs.
Right. So you're saying we don't have a construct in there to say like these plugins are intended. It's not, we'd say net A, comma net B, comma net C, but you might have parenthetically net A, comma net B. Those are a chain, comma.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Wait. So tell me again, why is it that we can't have net Q be a chain?
NetQ can be a chain. No, we are talking about that within the CNI there is called chaining mechanism is there. So the output of the one plugin is given as the input for the second plugin. So that particular mechanism is never captured in our documentation.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a gap here.
Okay. So,
if someone has to develop link aggregation models, they will go for the chaining mechanism. So the output of the first two CNI is given as input to the second CNI. So that use case, I think we never captured.
All right, I added a note about that, and maybe what we could do is start something in the discussion section of the document to
Okay.
that would be great, because yeah, I think that is a gap. There's no way to express that right now.
Mm-hmm. And the second item I had is about the meta plugins. So currently we are concentrating, everything is on the as a network object CRDs, but we didn't capture how we can represent this meta plugin as in the config file.
Okay, yeah. So one thing along that line is I think that it might be one of those things that we intentionally didn't specify to leave it up to the implementation itself to decide how it would use that. But there is a hint about it. It's like towards the top of the document, and it has to do with the default network. So there's a stanza that we added a few weeks ago that basically says, well, you know, the spec is set for a while. Like it expects that we're going to attach to the default network that's used, quote unquote, default network, and then we'll attach to the other sidecar networks as found in CRDs. And it basically says that default configuration can be specified in any way the implementation chooses. And so it could be in its own configuration, which I would assume to be, you know, etc c9 net.d config file, right? Or by another method. But yeah, maybe we should make it a you know, because that's another thing. Because hey, that could be one way that you specify a default network is by a CRD, right? So that could be, you know, another way that it's done.
No, so we did discuss this a few weeks ago, right? And I think what's going on here is that we're trying to write a spec that has a little broader lifetime and scope than the kubelet and CRI will support today. Because today, the kubelet and CRI do not support a daemon model. It does have to run, you know, the existing CNI plugin mechanism. It's going to pick one. So we know that the initial implementations are going to be a meta plugin, and they're going to be found by the usual mechanism.
Right,
We have
they're
been
going
looking,
to use that configuration because the kubelet does. Yeah.
but we have not chosen to write that in this spec because we want this spec to have a longer life than that fact. So maybe it belongs in some kind of appendix or addendum that is like a current implementation consideration or a roadmap issue or something like that. Saying we'll start out with a meta plugin that's found in the usual way. And yeah, that meta plugin is going to read its own config file that will specify the default. And, you know, later something else can happen.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Mike. I'll volunteer to create that appendix section, and yeah, I like the way that you framed it. That's I think that's a fair way to put it. Carl, you have another one here about the next item, or being a network perf test. Am I reading that correctly? Carl, did you want to move on to the next item about the perf test?
Sorry, my mic is mute. Sorry.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, I
Okay.
was keep on talking, and I was like, okay. So I want to talk about the network perf test documentation captured in the Kubernetes node proposal. So there is a proposal called Kubernetes node performance benchmarking. So they are trying to analyze some of the benchmarking for a node. Uh, Taking into the consideration of the CPUs and other details. So in that, the interesting part I was looking is the network performance testing. So I was wondering, like, whatever we are doing in the network plumbing group work for the meta plugins, right? This particular use case won't be capturing our network performance, right? Or because it's in Kubernetes, for Kubernetes, just a single interface, right? So it's never going to be affecting with our meta plugins. That's what I'm just asking, like whether our group has to look into this one, or is just like for Kubernetes just the network. Guys, any have any idea on that one?
If you're asking for something that exists, I'm not aware of it, and I think it's a good idea
Okay.
that there should be something.
Okay, cool. I thought you guys might know some knowledge on this network performance benchmarking in Kubernetes. That's why I want to know. Okay.
Well, I'm not a great expert, so don't take my opinion as authoritative.
Oh, okay. I think we can move on to the next item. Doug.
All right. Thank you, Carl. And another item from you on unification of
I think we have captured that one. I think I was thinking about this mic 5 points what is mentioned in the uh, sig group. So I was thinking about that one. So I also wondering the same thing, whether the device plugin one it's unifying, or it's because for the device plugin it's mostly containers, it's not pod. And also in most of the cases, in some cases, if you take SRVVF, if you go for some NUMA manager proposals, which has been already discussed in the resource management working group, in that case, the SRVV of that particular network is bounded to the container. It's not bounded to pods anymore, because the pod will be bounded to one CPUs. If what happens if the network card is bounded to another node, in this case, your performance will be less. So that's what I'm thinking, like whether we want to go for some kind of a network manager model that will take care of both the device plugin and the CNI, or it will try to coordinate both the guys together. I'm trying to get the idea from the group, what's their view on this.
Again, it's not specific to network, right? You also have this inhomogeneous connectivity for things like GPUs.
Yeah, but if you take in the not don't think that I'm keep on poking this SRV use case, but the thing is that if you look into the SRV use cases where you represent them as a network, but in some way they are not only network for you, in some case they are like a resource for the container. So that's one of the cases which we can't fit in both containers or in the pod.
I certainly agree that the network stuff is at the pod level, not the container level. I'm not convinced that it's really unique to networking, right? The storage volumes are also really at the pod level, and in general, a general subset of the containers in a pod have access to a given storage volume. So, yes, it's important to get the pod versus container distinction right, and no, it's not unique to networks.
Okay. I think Doug, you can move to the next one.
All right, thanks, Carl. All right, Petter, you had an item here about the action when a network is removed from a pod.
Yeah, so I apologize, I didn't read the multi-network proposals for some time, but I wonder, is there captured what should happen if a network object is removed while the network is used by pods?
Well, if there's a prior question here, right, you're assuming that should be possible, right? Maybe the question is, how should we prevent it?
Yeah, that's the question.
Right. So I noticed in the release notes for 1.10 that there was an advance on this topic. There is now such prevention for a couple of cases involving PVCs. I skimmed the discussion of it. I haven't had time to truly understand how it works. So I'm not sure what general lesson can be drawn from that. But if someone is aware of a high-level description of how this technique works, I'd love to see it. I mean, there's a basic principle problem here, which is in Kubernetes API, you can only do an atomic transaction on one object. You can't have a multi-object atomic transaction. But we've now got some things that that preserve referential integrity, more or less, which involves multiple objects. So is there, kind of a high-level principles-based description of how that's done? And if not, I'll try and dig it out of the discussion. Or maybe someone could ask the people who are responsible for that stuff if they have a high-level description of the concept.
All right, so no answers, just action items. And the next point, maybe it was already discussed, but can we, in the pod annotation for networks, can we just specify there how should be the NIC leading to this network named? Because go on, sorry.
So yeah, there was a proposal it was a workaround for the tuple uniqueness with CNI, but it would have achieved this as well. That was proposed by Suresh, and I am just skimming through here to see if I can find the comment, if it still exists on the spec. And the comment may have gotten resolved. But Petter, if you'd like, I will dig up the discussion on that. But I think...
Yeah, it should not be buried in a resolved comment. Please make sure it's in the document content somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. If not, it may be in the discussion section as well. So I'm going to make an item here for myself, and I can add some of that history into Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a good point, Mike.
Okay, I will go through the document anyways, but do you remember what was the outcome of the discussion?
So it in this particular case, to summarize, basically the gist was it wasn't necessarily because somebody wanted to manually assign the names, like they wanted to exactly know what the name was going to be, because by one viewpoint you could go to the results object and you could pull it from the results if you needed to know what it was. However, this was to solve the unique tuple that CNI itself uses. So the result of that is that Mike was talking about earlier in the meeting was some upstream changes to CNI.
But what Suresh suggested was basically a hack to put the interface name in the network name in a stylized way that we recognize, so we can take it out when we don't really want it there.
Yeah, that it was a decoration of that name in that case.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. All right, that concludes our hour here, and we just made it through those. So thanks everybody for getting these items on here and for the discussions today. I appreciate it a lot, and we'll catch you guys in another couple weeks.
Bye.